Now, let's talk a little bit about the Strait of Hormuz for a second. We've had what I would consider some conflicting information here from the Trump administration. And basically, he came out and said over the weekend that, and I'm sure you all heard about this, that if you, to Iran, if you don't open the Strait of Hormuz, we will start bombing your power plants and we will shut them down. Now, they then retaliated and said, okay, well, if you do that, we're going to start bombing the water facilities, the desalination facilities, around the Middle East, and we're going to cripple, the drinking water supply for these surrounding countries. Then Trump comes back and says, well, Iran is actually wanting to talk. We're already in talks with them. And he did like a 5-day, kind of ceasefire thing. They then claimed, of course, that no, we're not in talks. And that this was just him backing down because of their threats of taking out the water supply, But here we are today on Tuesday. It does sound like there are talks happening between the U.S. and Iran, which would hopefully de-escalate this thing. Maybe we are at the beginning of the end. Maybe by the time this episode airs on Friday, we have some clarity around where that is at. So unfortunately, it's very difficult for me to give a accurate kind of direction on what's going to happen with mortgage interest rates as a result of this. But here's what I can tell you is that their mortgage rates are following the headlines for sure. The technicals are there, but basically out the window at this point. And as I mentioned at the intro to this call, if you look at the charts between MBS or even 10-year and oil prices, they're literally the same chart. So as oil prices have been fluctuating up and down, as there's news that the strait is going to open, or we're in talks with Iran, or the war is going to end, or all of these things, it's really interesting. Now, a few other things that I want to point out about the Strait of Hormuz that I've heard talked about. Maybe some of these are rumors, but I think it's important to hear it anyway. One thing that Trump did come out and say is like, look, we don't really rely on our oil coming through the Strait of Hormuz. As I've mentioned, it's 20% of the world's oil comes through that strait. I also mentioned in previous podcasts that 50% of China's oil apparently comes through the Strait of Hormuz, and 70% of Japan's oil comes through the Strait of Hormuz. I just happen to have those ones off the top of my head. I'm sure there's other countries that rely more heavily on oil coming through there. But Trump's stance was, we don't rely that much on oil coming through the Strait of Hormuz. So even though we started this war with Israel, we are going to leave it up to the countries who have the biggest impact to work on helping to open up the strait, which was an interesting strategy. Now, with that being said, I watch a lot of podcasts about this stuff, and we did have 5 or 7 of our ally countries come out and say, yes, we will work with the U.S. to make sure that the strait is open. Now, what they're doing and what the timeline is for them to, participate in that, it's unclear at this point. And is it even necessary? Can we negotiate a true ceasefire that opens up the Strait of Hormuz this week? And that's not even necessary for these other countries to get involved, all of which seemed to do it a bit reluctantly, if I'm being honest with you, just based on, the interviews and the podcasts and the conversations that I've observed. Another interesting thing that I'll call it a rumor, but I did read this yesterday, that Japan, as I mentioned, they get 70% of their oil comes through the Strait of Hormuz, that they are negotiating directly with Iran for passage of their oil tankers to make sure that they get their supply of oil. And apparently they are paying a premium to allow those tankers to go through. This is for Japan. But the part that's interesting, and I don't know, I cannot verify this, but that Iran required them to make payment for that passage in Chinese yuan. So not US dollars. They wanted it paid in Chinese currency, which is interesting, I think. So look, I don't know if that's 100% true. I read it. It wouldn't surprise me, I suppose. And it makes you start wondering, like, what does that mean if we start seeing these types of large transactions handled in a different currency? Is that a, kind of a, canary in the coal mine? Is that like pointing towards, some powers that be trying to shift the dominant world currency away from the US dollar? Obviously there's been rumors about that. I'm no expert, so I'm not going to get into it. But if you're interested in doing some research, that might be a good topic to, go down a rabbit hole on and understand the validity of that.